Today's short passage describes a scene that is often too well known to thousands, or should I say millions of young women throughout history, right up to the present time. It will likely happen again this very day and for years to come. Hi, I'm Ken Godevanis, and this is Digging for Scriptural Gems. Thank you for joining us as we study 2 Samuel chapter 13, verses 15 to 19. It's a privilege to share my personal Bible study with you all. Amnon has just finished raping his half-sister Tamar. She did all she could to try and prevent him from doing so, but he prevailed by sheer physical force and an evil desire. Incest has now entered David's household. The act was complete, and the text tells us that Amnon, quote, now hated her with a hatred or disdain much greater than the love with which he had loved her, end of quote. The NAT Bible says he greatly despised her. At the end of our last study together, we were left with one question. Did Amnon really love Tamar? I don't know that we need to debate this for long. If you love someone, you don't rape them, period, end of statement. If you only lust after them and you have no control of yourself, you might rape them. Amnon did that. And if some of us are still not convinced, well, listen to Amnon's next words to her after the act. Quote, get up and go away. Leave. And he meant it. Hopefully, we're all convinced now. There's an old expression some of you may remember. Love them and leave them. It's used to describe someone who has had a lot of sexual relationships that they end after a short time without caring about the feelings of the other person. Songs have also been written describing such people. I can only imagine how many young women are taken advantage of in this way. It really is sad. Robert Jameson answers a question that we may well ask ourselves. Why did his desire of her, I won't say love, but his desire of her change to such hatred so quickly? He didn't even think of apologizing to her and perhaps making things better. He never thought of seeking her forgiveness. He didn't even give her a chance to compose herself. Why? Jameson says, quote, it is not unusual for persons instigated by violent and irregular passions to go from one extreme to another. In Amnon's case, the sudden revulsion is easily accounted for. The atrocity of his conduct, with all the feelings of shame, remorse, and dread of exposure and punishment, now burst upon his mind, rendering the presence of Tamar intolerably painful to him. End of quote. One does not know what physical condition Tamar was in after being raped, but Tamar managed to muster up enough strength to say, no, I won't. Sending me away now is much worse than the fact that you already raped me. End of quote. Again, here was a young woman still thinking of what the most appropriate action in the current circumstances was. And again, she was not thinking only of herself, but also of Amnon. And once more, he would not listen to her. And notice her attempted determination. No, I won't. She was outraged, and perhaps at this point, with justification, somewhat hysterical. Gusick says, quote, what Amnon did to Tamar was wrong, but he could still somewhat redeem the situation by paying her bride price in accordance with Exodus chapter 22, verses 16 and 17, and also in accordance with Deuteronomy chapter 22, verses 28 and 29. This kind of payment was meant to compensate for the fact that Tamar was now less likely to be married because she was no longer a virgin. Not only did he not listen, but he asked for help from his valet, if you like, and told him to, quote, throw this woman out of my presence and lock the door behind her, end of quote. The Hebrew text here is even cruder. It says, send this one, this woman, from upon me to the outside. Get her off me and throw her out to the exterior. Wow. This was the same man who moments or hours earlier was dying to have Tamar come to him. And now he wants her out of his presence and for her to be barred from ever returning. Jameson gives us a historical note of assistance here. He says, quote, the street door of houses in the East is always kept barred, the bolts being of wood. In the great mansions, where a porter stands at the outside, this precaution is dispensed with, and the circumstance, therefore, of a prince giving an order so unusual shows the vehement alarm or distress of Amnon's mind, end of quote. The text tells us the young man's servant, did just that. But it also mentions in verse 18 that she, Tamar, was wearing a long sleeve that is down to the wrists, garment or robe, perhaps reaching to the feet, and perhaps a varied colored tunic, although there is less scholarly support for that idea. Nevertheless, what she wore was typical of the dress worn by the virgin daughters of a king. It was a garment of privilege and status, showing the person did not have to do a lot of work. And once kicked out with the door locked behind her, Tamar put ashes on her head, tore her garment, and put her hand on her head and went away crying. All signs of distress. We note that Tamar correctly treated this as a calamity and did not hide the truth that a terrible crime was committed against her. She did not give place to the voice of shame, saying, this was somehow your fault, Tamar. For centuries, when rape happens, young women were made to feel shameful and were somehow talked or forced into feeling they were the ones to blame. Yes, this is changing today, but it still takes a lot of courage to accuse someone raping you, someone of raping you, especially in the case of incest. We need to pray for all our women and girls daily. We're going to stop there and dig a little deeper to gain more understanding and perhaps some applications for our own lives. As I read this account, I particularly wondered why the text says Tamar raised or put her hand on her forehead. So I looked for an answer, and again, Robert Jameson came to the rescue. He writes, quote, as her veil is not mentioned, it is probable that Amnon had turned her out of doors without it, and she raised her hand with the design to conceal her face, end of quote. David Gusick looks at this whole thing and writes this, quote, in this single-minded lust, Amnon only built upon the example of his father David. David was never this dominated by lust, but he was pointed in the same direction. David's multiple marriages, 2 Samuel chapter 3, verses 2 to 5, and his adultery with Bathsheba, 2 Samuel chapter 11, verses 2 to 4, displayed this same direction. This is often how the iniquity of the fathers is carried on by the children to the third and fourth generation, as Exodus chapter 20, verse 5 tells us. A child will often model a parent's sinful behavior and will often go further in the direction of sin the parent is pointed towards. End of quote. As I read Gusick's thoughts, two questions come to mind. First, is what he is saying likely to happen regardless of whether or not the child is aware of the parent's sin? One could arrive at two opinions here. A, what God stipulated in Exodus 20, verse 5, comes with no requirement for the child to be aware of the father's sin. However, if we believe that there is modeling involved, then B, for sure the child would need to be aware. I personally would, if required to make a decision, go with the scripture-driven answer. This can and does happen whether or not a child is aware of a parent's previous sin. I also believe that's the case when you consider the second generation or third generation. The second question I would wonder about is whether or not a parent's confessing his or her sin and repenting of it, followed by real apologies and proven and evident behavioral changes, observable behavioral changes, could offset the likelihood of a child following in their footsteps. I have no scripture to go by here, but my hunch is that there is a possibility for this happening. That is, the child does not follow in the same sin, especially knowing about it and being resolved not to commit the same error or errors of their parent. I would, however, value your own thoughts on these matters, so please write to us. Make some comments on this. It would be so helpful to many. There's no doubt that Tamar deserved much better treatment than she got. She was an Israelite. She was Amnon's relative, his sister, and she was a princess. But evil often does not distinguish what havoc it does based on those things, sadly. Join us next time as we find out where Tamar ends up and how the sinful act of her stepbrother is protected. In the meantime, we encourage you to share these videos, share these studies with others, put them on social media, pass them along. Write to us with your comments, your questions, your thoughts. Keep on studying God's words. And we also ask, and we really appreciate it, if you would like our video and subscribe to our YouTube channel, Digging for Scripture.